Here we go. We know that we will still have a lot of work to do and ensure that state investments can keep up with inflation. So I have also used my broad veto authority to provide school districts with predictable long-term increases for the foreseeable future.
For those of you who are unfamiliar with Wisconsin politics, that is Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers signing a very important education bill yesterday. Now let's get into the details of why this bill is just so important for the state and also for the country. Common Dreams reported that among the dozens of Democratic Wisconsin governors, Tony Evers' line item vetoes for state Republicans' 2-year budget on Wednesday was a move to boost funding for public education for the next 4 centuries. That's not a typo. That was not a misprint. Yes, 400 years, the next 4 centuries, and they continue on. The budget approved by Wisconsin lawmakers hiked the revenue limit for school districts, or how much they can raise from state aid and local property taxes, by $325 per student for the 2023 to 2024 school year and the 2024 to 2025 school year. Evers, a former public school teacher and administrator, turned that into for 2023 to 24-25. Now, this is particularly critical. I'm from Illinois. If anyone knows the history of the Wisconsin politics, it has not been this bright and optimistic for the future, particularly under the previous governor. But why this is so critical in the state of Wisconsin particularly is because education in the state was hit really hard by the effects of COVID and by their previous horrific and current Republican legislators. The Cap Times reported that it comes amid high inflation and after 2 years of frozen per pupil revenue limits in the previous state budget. Republicans justified those limits by pointing to the significant amounts of federal COVID-19 relief funding districts received. But districts suggested that put them in a challenging position as they relied on one-time funds for ongoing costs. Now, just to put this in perspective, think of this like after we received stimulus and politicians kept saying, they're good. They got that one-time stimmy check, but we all know rent keeps coming. I've got to pay it every month. That one-time stimulus check hasn't actually helped me that much in my life. That is what they were trying to do with education in Wisconsin. And the Cap Times continued and they wrote that in many cases, districts now face fiscal cliffs for the 2024 to 2025 budget after the federal money has expired. The Madison Metropolitan School District, for example, provided the maximum base wage increase for staff this year of 8%, combined with other costs, faces a cliff of more than 20 million before it has even started working on that budget. The change, by the time it expired in 24-25, would add $130,650 per pupil to a district's revenue limit. The revenue limit for MMSD in 2022 to 2023 was $14,254 per student. In total, it would add tens of billions of dollars school districts around the state would be allowed to spend in that final school year if the enrollment in public school remained relatively constant for the next 4 centuries. And our very own Senator Nina Turner applauded this legislation and Governor Evers' tactics. On Twitter, she tweeted out, "This is how you're supposed to legislate," and she could not be more right. It would be great if all states prioritized education the way Governor Evers is doing in this case. Of course, we aren't seeing that. We're seeing a lot of feckless Democratic lawmakers not really willing to fight these types of fights and to take these sort of extreme measures to ensure that our essential programs in this country are funded. And Tony Evers was willing to do that. And it's a state that's not particularly progressive. This has been a swing state. This is a state that had a long, hard fought battle to ensure that a quite literal fascist wasn't sitting on their state Supreme Court and instead got a progressive Supreme Court justice seated on their state Supreme Court. But we're not seeing this type of action on the federal level. This is what we're seeing on the federal level. The United States spent $877 billion on military in 2022, a new report says, more than 10 times the federal education spending. And I know that you just got here, Mayor Mondale, but I want to ask you, as someone who does kind of work in this area or as a mayor, how important is education and how important is what Wisconsin is doing here?
Listen, I think it's sad that a state has to do this, and also every state is not doing this. And you made some extremely important points. The fact that Wisconsin is not this super progressive space, but we saw a super conservative justice overreach, and we saw him get replaced by a progressive, shows how much politicians are missing the mark on what they can and can't do as it pertains to where their citizens, where their residents are. People are way more progressive than their elected officials, and Wisconsin is a great example of how we know that. I'll tell you another sad part about all of this. What we're not talking about is what it costs this country to undereducate people. The fact that we continue to spend so much on military, 10, 12 times the next closest country, and we're losing in the education battle. We are, out of all the developed nations, probably at the bottom of everything that matters: science, math, and also history. And it does not look like this is the way forward if America is gonna continue to have a democracy that's functioning at a high level where we are, saving lives and extending people's lives, especially when we take a look at the fact that a large portion of this country believe the S that Donald Trump is saying.
Right. I mean, if that's not an indictment of our education system, I don't know what is. And I think you make an excellent point about how, they love to brag. Our country loves to brag about being the #1 superpower in the world. And sure, if we decided to crush every other country, maybe we could do that. But we're not crushing them in math. We're not crushing them in science. Our education standards are abysmal. We're not crushing them in healthcare. I think we're comparable to Slovenia on the rankings of healthcare, which is a country I think that most red-blooded Americans would feel maybe a little embarrassed to be sitting next to on that kind of chart. So this is a huge thing that's going on in Wisconsin. Massive shout out to Governor Tony Evers for being willing to do what's hard and not falling back like we see so many Democrats do on, we're not there yet. We can't fight this fight, and just actually doing what matters.